What are the police lies you should be looking out for that they can use to manipulate you? In this video, I'm going to cover the 5 lies police use to manipulate you, and I'm going to illustrate how these lies were used in the true story of a man by the name of Thomas Perez Jr. And when the police used these lies against him, it scarred him forever. In fact, wait around till the end of this video and I'll lay out for you how Thomas Perez Jr. finally received justice for how he was treated. Lie number 1, if you call us, we are here to help. Like any profession, there are good cops and there are bad cops. The problem, though, is there appears to be a bias. Because of the way that police are trained, they have a tendency to believe that if you called them with some type of disturbance or issue going on, then they are going to be suspicious of you and they may label you the suspect. In fact, be prepared. If you call the cops about something suspicious, don't be surprised if the cops begin to treat you and label you as the prime suspect. That's exactly how it started out for Thomas Perez Jr. His father, Thomas Perez Sr., who was 71 years old, went out for a walk with the family dog. But Thomas Perez Jr. became very concerned because when the family dog came back, the father never made it back. What did Thomas Perez Jr. do? He did what any of us would do. He called the police. The problem? After sharing his story, the criminal investigators chose not to believe Thomas Perez Jr., and now they began to assume that he was the prime suspect in his father's murder. Thomas, knowing he did nothing wrong, agreed to come into the police station and answer police officer questions in the hope that they could help find his father. Here's the deal. If you call the police, understand that police are trained to treat everyone as a suspect, but especially you if you're the one who called in. As such, calling cops to come out to your house can be a very serious risk, particularly if you're an inexperienced young teenager like Thomas Perez Jr. Lie number 2, just answer my questions and you'll be free to go. If you call the police to your house or you approach an officer, they are trained to make you feel comfortable sharing information, but you better understand you are not playing on a level playing field. The problem? Police can lie about the little things and the big things. This is exactly what happened to Thomas Perez Jr. If you remember what I said earlier, Thomas agreed to come into the police station in order to answer questions to help find his father. But what started as an innocent conversation at the police department turned into a 17-hour interrogation where the police began to grill Thomas Perez Jr. looking for the truth. You need to understand that police lie, and police are trained to lie to you if it will assist in their criminal investigation. As an example, they lied to Thomas Perez Jr. during his interrogation by telling him that his elderly father was dead. In fact, they took that lie so far as to tell Thomas that not only was his father dead, but they actually had his father right now down at the morgue with a toe tag on him. As they continued to interrogate Thomas Perez Jr., they then told him that they had already found evidence establishing the fact that he had committed a murder, and it would be better for him if he just admitted to it. This poor young man became so upset, and he was trying to be honest. He told the police he didn't remember doing anything. Here is where the cops really manipulated this young man. They then began to tell him that, hey, Thomas, look, the human brain will many times try to suppress troubling memories. That's why you don't remember. The cops continued to play out this lie so far, and this really upsets me, that they actually brought in this young man's Labrador retriever by the name of Margosha. And they threatened that if he didn't confess to the actual murder, that they would actually have his Labrador retriever euthanized as a stray. They then took the lie so far that they actually brought the dog into the interrogation room and they told him he could finally say his goodbyes. After the poor young man cried all over the dog and he was very upset, they took the dog out of the room and they then looked at him and said, "Okay, it's too late. Your dog is dead. It's time to move on." The detective, which I think is so cold-blooded, then went on to tell this poor young man, Thomas Perez Jr. I'm going to read to you what he said. He said, "How can you sit there and say you don't know what happened? and your dog is sitting there looking at you, knowing that you killed your dad. Look at your dog. She knows because she was walking through all of the blood. Even though Thomas Perez Jr. was promised he would be free to go if he answered all the questions, he was not released. As is common, they told Thomas Perez Jr. that he would be free to leave at any time during the interrogation, but they never gave him that opportunity. As they began to tighten the screws and the interrogation got more intense, at no time did they allow him to be able to leave, and he was fully in detainment and not permitted to leave under any set of circumstances. Lesson learned: the police are not questioning you without a motive. If you are being questioned by the police, always assume you are a suspect. If you take that further, if you decide you're going to walk into a police station and put yourself to be subjected to an interview, understand, even if the cops tell you that you're free to leave, the moment you start opening your mouth, there's a very high probability they will not let you leave. And many times they don't ever tell you when the interview is transitioned from a voluntary conversation into a detainment where you are now trapped in that room. You have a right to remain silent, and you should exercise that right by being crystal clear. By saying, "Officer, I exercise my right to remain silent, and I exercise my right to have an attorney present during any questioning." Then keep your mouth closed. Line number 3, we've already investigated the matter and we know exactly what happened. Many people don't understand that police rarely investigate the truth before reaching out to possible suspects. I have personally handled thousands of criminal cases and tried over 100 criminal jury trials, and I have been shocked by the lack of investigation that takes place by the police before they choose to walk up and start labeling someone a suspect. The worst place to be is in the crosshairs of a lazy detective who doesn't have the work ethic to perform a thorough criminal investigation before labeling you a criminal. That is exactly what happened with Thomas Perez Jr. The police literally did no criminal investigation before labeling him the murderer of his father. Think about all the things the police could have done before labeling Thomas Perez Jr. as a murderer. They first could have checked to see, did his father use any credit cards? Did he have a calendar? Is it possible he bought a plane ticket? Did he go visit some of his other family members or friends? None of this was performed. Instead, the investigators chose to be focused on the fact they didn't like that Thomas Perez Jr. seemed distracted and unconcerned on the 911 call. Cops showed up and they found that the father's cell phone and his wallet was still at the home, but the biggest thing they focused on was the fact that the messy house was to them a sign of a struggle may have taken place. This is so very important to understand. If the police have already labeled you the suspect, they are now going to filter everything you tell them, everything you give them, everything they see during the investigation. They will now filter it through the lens of believing it provides evidence that you have done something to establish guilt. The messy house that they interpreted as a sign of a struggle was so dumb because there was ample evidence, if they had done an investigation, to establish the fact that there was actually construction and renovation going on at the house during this time. To make it worse, young Thomas Perez Jr., so concerned about the situation with his father, agreed and gave consent to allow the police to come into the home and do a thorough search, all in the name of trying to locate his father. The police were fully prepared for this, and as soon as they entered into the home, they went ahead and brought a police cadaver dog to do a thorough search of the entire home. And of course, when the police dog gets in there, it alerts for the presence of a dead body because it found some blood stains. The cops, of course, immediately assumed that Thomas Perez Jr. had committed this murder. What was the real cause of the blood stains? Well, if the police had actually done a thorough criminal investigation, they would have learned that Thomas Perez Sr. was a diabetic. And the actual blood stains were because he would use a testing device to determine what his blood sugar level was. A critical lesson here: once you let the police into your home, everything they find will be used against you and you will not be presumed innocent. Remember, unless the cops have a valid search warrant or exigent circumstances, you always have the right to refuse consent to search your home. What if the cops just forced their way into Thomas's home? Well, even in that situation, he had a right to remain silent, and even if the cops illegally entered into his home, he could have been in a position where he did not have to fill in the blanks for the officers so that they could try to paint a picture of his presumed guilt. Additionally, if cops enter into a home illegally, in that situation, a motion to suppress can be filed to ensure that any evidence gathered, cannot be used against him in a possible criminal trial. Lie number 4. I'm a great judge of character, and I can tell when something's suspicious or someone's acting criminal. Here's the problem. Some detectives may be good at using their hunch to track down criminals. But many detectives don't like to see any evidence that goes against their hunch when they believe you are a criminal. In fact, some detectives will continue to dig for any evidence establishing your guilt of anything just so that they can validate continuing their criminal investigation so that it can lead to an arrest warrant. This has never been illustrated better than in the story of Thomas Perez Jr. Here's what's crazy. As it turns out, after interrogating Thomas Perez Jr. for over 17 hours and failing to conduct any investigation whatsoever, Thomas Perez, his father, was still alive. Court records and reports indicate that Thomas Perez Jr.'s sister ended up calling the same police department and informing them that their father was alive. The police then learned, which they could have found out if they did any type of investigation, that the father had actually taken a bus over to visit a family member and then a train over to visit a friend. And then at the end, he took an actual flight to Oakland to visit his daughter. Now check this out. The police actually drove all the way over to pick up the father from the airport, but they refused to close out the criminal investigation against Thomas Perez Jr. Instead, they somehow convinced a judge to sign off on a search warrant to go back over to the house again and do a search for evidence involving Thomas Perez Jr. supposedly assaulting an unknown victim. Of course, they found nothing. To make matters worse, the police ended up refusing to let Thomas Perez Jr. leave for a total of 36 hours. The lesson here, when a police officer believes you did something wrong, it's very difficult for them to admit that they were wrong. The way to avoid this, don't talk so much. Exercise your right to remain silent. If you choose to talk to the police, don't forget, no good deed goes unpunished. Choosing to talk to the police, you should expect aggressive interrogation techniques from the police, and even after you pass all their tests, don't be surprised if they continue to look for more evidence to establish some type of guilt, even in the face of your innocence. Lie number 5. It's impossible to make somebody admit to something they didn't do. There has long been this belief that no person would ever confess to a crime they didn't commit. Unfortunately, that's just not true. There has been documented dozens and dozens of cases where people have been subjected to aggressive police interrogation techniques, and when police use these techniques, it often leads to confusion and disorientation and ultimately a false confession. Unfortunately, that is exactly what happened with Thomas Perez Jr. Remember, Thomas Perez Jr. was subjected to advanced interrogation techniques for over 17 hours. He had been told by the police that they had already found his father dead and that he had a toe tag on him at the morgue, and that if he didn't confess, they were going to euthanize his Labrador retriever. How did the police justify this at all? Well, when they questioned one of the detectives said, "I thought if we told him that we had located the body, maybe he would give us more information about what had occurred." That sounds a lot like a police officer that had already decided that he was guilty. So much for the presumption of innocence. Unfortunately, the police became even more aggressive from there. In addition to placing him into sleep deprivation, they also refused to provide Thomas Perez Jr. his prescribed medication. At one point during the interrogation, they drove Thomas Perez Jr. to go get some coffee, and he was asking for his medication, and they told him that he didn't need his medication because they already knew that he had killed his father, and they said this, "When can you take us to show us where your daddy is first?" This led to Thomas becoming so upset that he began to pull his own hair out of his head. He began hitting himself. he began to actually rip his shirt off his body and make noises that no one could understand, all because the police were relentless and badgering him about a murder that never happened. Ultimately, after threatening to kill Thomas's dog if he didn't confess to the murder, during a break in the interrogation, Thomas Perez Jr. attempted to commit suicide. Ultimately, this led to exactly what the police wanted. Thomas confessed to a murder that never took place and began to believe the own officer's lies that he must have killed his own father. What's the lesson here? Both sophisticated and unsophisticated people are no match for these aggressive techniques that police officers use whenever they've decided they believe they know who is their suspect. Look, I want you to understand, cops are trained to do exactly this. They are trained to use these techniques in addition to lying and manipulation in order to lead to a possible confession of someone they believe committed a crime. Unfortunately, though, this can lead to people confessing to things they never did. I can't say this any clearer. You have absolutely nothing to gain by answering police questions. You have a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, and you have a Sixth Amendment right to have an attorney present during any questioning. It is always the innocent that have the most to lose by failing to exercise their constitutional rights. Whatever you do, never let a detective make you feel bad or feel like a criminal for exercising your constitutional rights. Police are trained to do this with you. They'll say things like, well, what do you need a lawyer for, man? If you're innocent, why don't you just tell me what happened? Or why are you holding out? Oh, you're going to lawyer up now? Understand that is another police technique. Now, what happened with Thomas Perez Jr.? He was ultimately released from police custody, and he brought a civil lawsuit against the Fontana Police Department. The ultimate settlement? $900,000. Now, I want to ask you, does that seem fair to you? Is that a reasonable amount of money for what he went through? In my humble opinion, no, it's not enough money. But his attorney advised him to take the $900,000 settlement because he was afraid of the dreaded qualified immunity that may overturn what they receive on appeal. That is always the problem with qualified immunity. It protects police action like this unless there is a clear violation of law that meets almost identical facts of the case at hand. As far as we know, these detectives are still working in law enforcement, and there is nothing that is stopping these detectives from victimizing another innocent person like Thomas Perez Jr. Now, if it isn't bad enough, did you know that it's not only what you say, but also what you don't say that can incriminate you with the police? Is it possible for cops to use your silence against you? Check out this next video where I break down how cops have a Fifth Amendment loophole. See you over there.